This is why I much preferred to be in a medium or even a higher level prison than a minimum. Because I can only speak from my own experience over 19 years in the Virginia prison system, and maybe it's different other places, they have different rules or different ideas, but for me at those higher levels, there was a level of respect and there was a level of consideration because there were actual consequences. Like the first prison I went to was a level 4, and the first thing my cell partner does is tell me, this is where my knife is, don't ever put anything in the way in case I need to get to it, and also don't mess up my hiding spot. And I was like, okay, cool, like that's the kind of place this is. This isn't the jail where guys are getting into fist fights, arguing over what the score of the game was. Like, this is a place that potentially has more consequences. And the result of that is there is far less violence. There are far fewer fights at those higher levels, but when it happens, it tends to be more serious. And it's not to say there aren't any. Like, you have guys that run their mouth, guys that like get slick, guys that get whatever, and generally something happens to them. And actually, I was always impressed by the older heads, the guys who would carry a knife, but at the same time would let those guys slide because they realized they didn't want to take it to that level. It wasn't even just about what was right. It was about the fact that it wasn't worth it to them to put themselves out there or to lose more good time or to never go home or to, whatever the consequences were. But so this greater level of respect and consideration made it pretty comfortable because the majority of the violence, when it was serious, was about drugs, it was about money, or it was about gang stuff. So if you didn't get drugs you couldn't pay for, if you didn't run up debts you couldn't pay for, if you didn't gamble money you didn't have, and you didn't get involved in a gang, generally you were going to be okay. Now, there were certain communities this wasn't always true for. Like, people who had child sex charges tended to have a really hard time. Yeah, the gangs would extort them, other people would extort them, they would get, they wouldn't be allowed to use a phone, they would have problems. That happened. It didn't happen to everybody, it didn't happen everywhere, but obviously, like, they may not feel as comfortable at a medium or high level as they do at a lower level when they've got a lot more protection or a lot more people in their situation. But if you've got what they call good charges, if you don't have a charge against a kid, if you don't have something messed up, and you stay out of the way and you don't create problems, especially if you have something to contribute to that economy or contribute to that community, you can be a guy in the law library, you can be a math tutor, you can be a whatever. If you're there helping people, other people see that and they're like, yo, we like this guy, he's contributing, like this guy is helping the community. So it's weird because in a weird way, the guy who makes wine or the guy who makes, a still and cooks off clear is basically in the same category as the GED teacher. They're doing something for the community and people recognize that. Now the guy who's got way too much money and runs his mouth and does he's probably not gonna have the best time. Like, and we had a millionaire who had kind of a rough time because he had a good run of it and he was actually really cool about it. Like, he wasn't, running his mouth, he wasn't out of the way, but somebody finally got their eyes on that money and decided they wanted some of it and they weren't getting enough of it, and they ruined it for everybody because he ended up checking in and getting shipped somewhere else. But generally, as long as you stayed out of the way, it was a really comfortable thing. Whereas when I went down to a level 2, so I was at Nottoway for 4 years, I was at Buckingham for 13 years, I was in the jail and the other place for about a year, so the way it all adds up. So I go to Coffeewood for my last little bit, and I'm there, and it is profoundly unpleasant. Like, first, I went from having a single cell in the honor pod where, like, I was good, I'd earned my way, I had a great job, I volunteered, I taught classes, like, even during the pandemic, I was, like, recording videos that were being played statewide. I was able to do something with my time. I was able to have a meaningful existence. I get shipped to Coffeewood, to this dormitory, and all of a sudden I'm in a big room with 82 people just stacked one on top of the other. I'm like, yo, this isn't really cool. You walk into the bathroom and it's just 4 toilets side by side with no divider between them, and like you sit down, you're basically touching knees, 4 urinals, but you don't really care about that. But how do you have a divider for the urinal and not for the toilet? Like, how does that make any sense? You go into the shower and you just got 5 shower heads side by side. You got no privacy. There's literally not a single place in there that you can be alone for even a second. Like, you are constantly surrounded by people. Let me say, you might be in the bathroom in the middle of the night for 1 second alone, and then somebody's gonna come in behind you to use the bathroom. It was a horrible kind of psychological environment. So everybody's already under stress because of that, because they have no privacy, they have no quiet, they have no space of their own, like everything is shared. And then additionally, like, you've got the stressors of just a bunch of idiots, a bunch of guys who've got like 2 years and think they're tough or want to prove how tough they are, or people that don't have any consequences. Like, they get into a fist fight and they think the worst that's going to happen is they're going to lose. Like, dude, you've never seen somebody slammed on the fucking concrete or stabbed in the neck. Like, once you see that, you realize the consequences can be a lot more severe. But they didn't have the knives there. They didn't have that mindset. Like, people, this is what blew my mind. People were afraid to have knives because they didn't want to get caught. Like, they didn't want to get, if I get caught, that'll run my time up, but they'll go get 5 fights in one day. Like, somebody can't slip and hit their head or something serious can't happen. It's just, it was such a juvenile mindset, and it was such an inexperienced mindset, and it was such a young mindset, and that's what I hated. A guy who's got 2 years, who's 18 years old, is the absolute worst guy to be around. I would much rather be around a lifer every day, all day, no matter what. Because that lifer has, after at least a certain period of time, reconciled the fact that he's got to make a life out of this. He's got to figure out a way to live in this existence. Usually does a really good job. I knew a lot of lifers that live, in many ways, better lives than people I see out here. They were at peace, they had a way to get back to their communities, they found something they loved to do, they had some kind of like spiritual or religious practice. Like, they lived the best life in prison that a lot of people don't live out here. Whereas that 18-year-old with 2 years on his sentence or 16 months on his sentence, man, he's a terror. Like, you can't reason with this person. Like you feel pushed into this situation where like the only option is violence, and it's really hard to walk away from. I had a couple situations when I was at Coffeewood that was like, man, I got to walk away from this, and I have to swallow my pride, and it's not pleasant, but ultimately, obviously, it's worth it. Like, I'm not going to sacrifice my whole experience. I'm not going to sacrifice everything I worked for some dumbass, put me in that situation. But not everybody's at that level of maturity. So you see, old timers, and you see old heads, guys who've grown up in this system of respect and consideration, who end up really hurting somebody. And it ends up being the thing that costs them, their parole if they're pre-95. So, they've been locked up for 25 years or something. Or it ends up costing them good time, or it ends up costing them a chance to go home, because they've been institutionalized to this other mindset that these kids just don't have. It's one of the reasons I think everybody should start at a higher level and have to work their way down rather than starting at a level 2. That's just a terrible idea. Like, that's just bad for everybody. But then you have the administration too, because at a higher level, man, they have serious stuff to worry about. Like, they have to worry about stabbings, they have to worry about gang stuff, they worry about whatever. At level 2, they got nothing to worry about. So they're running around just nitpicking and trying to find things to give you a charge for, and telling you you can't have a cup on your locker past 6 a.m. Like, you can't have a cup on your, like, really? Like, this is your idea of like reforming people, like policing where they put their coffee cup? The level of pettiness at a level 2 was so far beyond anything that I've ever seen. And yet that was just kind of the accepted norm. So these are the people that are theoretically like the least threat or require the least whatever, and you're going to treat them the worst. Like, you're going to not allow them to live the freest. Like, shouldn't it be the other way around? Like, we have restriction on the people we're afraid of, like, causing violence, and then we give them a little more freedom and a little more responsibility. You go down to level 2, a little more freedom, a little more responsibility. Like, our entire prison system is backwards. There's no gradual transition. There's no transition from like high custody to low custody. People get released from 23-1 all the time, and then they're just out in the world with no supervision and no structure. Like, what we're doing is just so antithetical to anything reasonable. Like, if you were to explain this to a stranger who had never heard of prison, they would look at you like you were absolutely crazy. And yet we get up every day and just accept that it's normal because it's been like this for a while. But I was talking to a friend the other day. We found an article from back in the 1930s where somebody was talking about how desperate prison reform was and laying out every single thing that I'm saying. Like, everything that I'm saying, he was saying in the 1930s, and yet we haven't progressed. Like, we haven't gotten anywhere. And I just think that's a shame because people don't care, or people don't know. And that's one of the reasons I'm on here, is to let people know, like, yo, this is what your tax dollars are doing. Like, this is the cost and the consequence. This is why we have the recidivism rate we do. This is why we have the problems we do. This is why we essentially have a throwaway system. Like, we can do something differently. This guy in 1930 knew he could do something differently. But it requires, like, knowledge, and it requires will, and I think that we're working toward that. So don't end up in prison, but if you do, make sure you go to a medium or high. You're going to like your time a whole lot better.